Hi, and welcome everyone to McBrayer webinar, Myths, Masks, and Mandates. We are here to talk about some of the most up-to-date and current issues. And most importantly, we're going to focus on myths. In the past 18 months, as we all have lived, we have faced challenges we never expected. And about a year ago or so, we thought the hope for this vaccine was going to be life altering in terms of bringing us back to normal. And it was highly anticipated and we were so excited about it. That is until the vaccine actually came. And now that we have a vaccine, it has caused all sorts of questions, concerns, myths, fears, and discussions in the workplace. And so today we're going to try to address some of those to give you some practical guidance in light of the mandates from the federal government, mandates that you impose individually, and just try to deal with communications with and among your employees. So in this seminar, what we want to do is we want to set aside all political, social, personal agendas, and we're going to focus on facts and we're going to focus on the law. That is all we're going to focus on, and that is where you should target your conversations with your employees and when you are developing your policies. So we're going to try to provide you some guidance in that respect. So what are we going to do today? We're going to cover a wide range of topics. Like I said, we're going to start with some myths, and we're going to, again, address how to maintain a safe and productive workplace. Obviously, the safety issue is of our foremost concern, and it's something we're going to be dealing with for a while, especially with the different variants that have come out and all the breakthrough cases that I'm sure all of us have experienced. Again, we're going to continue to talk about the ever-evolving guidance for handling positive cases in your workplace. And more importantly, what's next? How are we going to deal with booster shots, accommodation requests, and any of the new potential laws and regulations that are coming down the pike? As you may have seen, and if some of you have been regular attendees at our webinar series that we put on every Halloween that we entitle Scary Stories from the Human Resources Department, that seminar will be held again annually at the end of October at Halloween. And we do try to focus there on non-COVID issues because the employment law is still happening outside of COVID, believe it or not. In the next month or so, we do anticipate there'll be legal challenges to some of the things we're talking about today, some changing guidance. And so we'll certainly touch on these COVID issues and vaccine mandates, but that seminar is going to be focused also on emerging employment law issues. So we encourage you to attend that as well. So today we're going to start with vaccine mandates, which is by far the most controversial of all the topics that we're going to talk about today. And really, who would have thought? Who would have thought that this would be the most controversial? Again, going back to a year ago when we were excited about the prospect of a vaccine putting an end to this pandemic, and all of the talk of the Trump administration about getting the vaccine on a warp speed path and getting this so that we can, again, get back to normal. But part of what we have lost in the last year and a half is a focus on common sense and a focus on what we already do in our country, in our workplaces, and through the government. So let's take a look at common sense before we get into these vaccine mandates. We have all our lives lived under vaccine mandates. None of us have gone to school without a religious or a medical accommodation without getting a handful of vaccines. Polio, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Hep B, measles, mumps, rubella, meningitis. All of these vaccines were required to go to public school. And the reason wasn't because of a political agenda or monetary agenda. The reason was all for public health, period. This pandemic is something that is a threat to public health. I think we can all agree on. And the other aspect of our lives that those of you who are not in healthcare may not have known, but healthcare industry has been under vaccine mandates for decades. In order to work in healthcare, you have to have a handful of vaccines, including hepatitis B, flu, pneumonia, MMR, and maybe some others. And it's just now that other industries are facing a vaccine mandate or considering a vaccine mandate that they're saying, well, you can't do this. Well, healthcare has been doing it for decades. And again, it comes down to public health. That's what this is all about. So what we want to do today is not lose sight of common sense, not lose sight of what we have done for decades in this country and through our government, and to focus on facts. So let's start with the most recent announcement from President Biden. He had announced that there's going to be he's going to implement through his rulemaking authority vaccine mandates for a couple of industries to get somewhere near 80 and 100 million workers vaccinated. He's going to do that through healthcare providers who receive Medicare funding and employers of 100 or more employees. So the good news for those of you who fall into that category is takes the heat off your back. If you were considering vaccine mandate, struggling with whether to put it into effect in your workplace, if this goes through and the challenges are upheld, you won't have a choice. So it takes the heat off of you. The bad news is employees are still going to talk about it. There's going to be chatter. There's going to be discord. They're going to complain, and you're still going to have to deal with it. I mean, let's think about it. You're spending an hour today of your time dealing with this issue to try to learn some more and figure out what we're going to do. So let's talk about the two biggest myths before we move on to some of the others. The two biggest myths that I think will be a common theme throughout your discussions with your employees and throughout developing your own personal policy is the first one. We'll start with that this vaccine was rushed. I don't trust this vaccine because it was rushed. Corners were cut and therefore it's not safe. So let's look at the facts. On May 15th of 2020, President Trump introduced Operation Warp Speed. That operation was not to cut corners, and that is not what he advertised, and it's not what actually happened. Operation Warp Speed was an $18 billion fund to spur the manufacture and distribution of vaccines when they became available. The goal was to get 300 million vaccines out as soon as possible. I have never counted the 300 million, and I think it would take me a very long time. That is an enormous ask, an enormous task. Operation Warp Speed was to move forward the manufacture and distribution of these vaccines once they became authorized. The authorization, yes, there were some avenues of red tape that were cut, but that none of those avenues affected the safety or the testing that needed to be done in order to get the vaccine to the point where it could be authorized, emergency use or otherwise. They followed traditional practices in all of the scientific methods, hypotheses, and testing before they received emergency use authorization. And so what happened during Operation Warp Speed is as Pfizer and Moderna and these other companies were developing their vaccine and testing the vaccine, they were concurrently starting production, assuming that the vaccine was going to be safe and effective, and assuming that the vaccine was going to be approved, so that once it was, there was no delay in the manufacture and distribution. You all saw UPS trucks, FedEx trucks with the first doses of vaccine as soon as it got approved. How did that happen? It happened because they had been working on it. And so the truth is that no corners were cut in safety. No corners were cut in testing procedures. It was about getting that $18 billion to these companies to manufacture and distribute as soon as authorization was received. And so again, and they also were looking for a 50% efficacy rate to reduce when you got the vaccine, to help reduce the spread and transmission and to, again, reduce the variants that are coming out. And if we think about it, the flu vaccine has about a 40% efficacy rate. When these vaccines came out, they hit 90+%. So they exceeded the expectations. So Operation Warp Speed was the start of it back in May of 2020. And again, it wasn't to cut corners for safety. So now the second biggest myth that will be part of your discussion is, well, this is a new vaccine. This vaccine's only been around for 9 months. They started it, they rushed it through, which we've already talked about, and you want me to take it? I don't know that it's safe. Well, what is the truth? So SARS viruses are not new. If you ever see in the news that COVID-19, you'll also see reference to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That is the virus that causes COVID-19. SARS has been around for decades. We all remember back in 2002 when Asia encountered the SARS outbreak, and in 2012 when the Middle East encountered the MERS outbreak. Those were all SARS viruses. And what we all need to remember, going back to common sense, is epidemiologists, infectious disease experts, public health experts have been working behind the scenes on preventing pandemic-like viruses from to become pandemics. And in the event that they do, these infectious disease experts have been studying how to stop it. What do we need to do? Back when SARS hit in 2002, the first thing that they started focusing on was a vaccine. Now, fortunately, I do believe that the SARS outbreak in 2002 was different from COVID-19 today because you had to be symptomatic for it to spread. Ultimately, it has either died or dwindled to where it's not a public health threat like it had been in 2002. But back then, they began work on vaccines for SARS viruses, coronaviruses. The groundwork for these vaccines started in 2002, not May of 2020. That is fact, that is not fiction. They have been working on vaccines for these types of viruses who all have that same common thread for 20 years or 19 years. And so when you put these two together and you understand that these vaccines there were no corners cut and they've been working on for 20 years, it brings into the foreground that there is safety here. And if you look at anything we do in medicine, vaccines are probably one of the safest things we do overall. So those are the first two myths. And that's where I think we all should start. And we all need to remember when discussing or having discussions with employees, get the literature, find the information, and present it as fact. And so these bullet points that we have up on this slide should be part of your communication to your employee, whether it is a mandatory vaccine from the government or something that you yourself are going to mandate as an employer. And this, again, is regardless of personal views. This is all for public health, all to get back to normal, to be able to function without having the severity of health issues that come along with COVID. And that's what we're trying to get to, a point where the severe illness isn't crippling our healthcare system and isn't endangering the lives of each other, our employees, and our families. We need to look no further than an article that came out this week that Kentucky has 6 of the top 10 counties in the country with the highest COVID rates. 6 counties in Kentucky make the top 10. That is an extraordinary amount. You also see in the news that our healthcare facilities are running out of beds. You see from other states where individuals are turned away for other medical reasons, heart attacks, strokes, cancer patients, because they're running out of beds. They're running out of staff. The Kentucky National Guard has come in and is placed at a dozen or so healthcare facilities within this state just to help with staffing. We need to get the severe illness under control. This is a public health initiative. That is our focus. That is where you should focus your communications. Again, we're going to stay away from political and personal agendas. We're going to focus on facts. So let's talk about some of these myths. So the first one that we hear, probably the most common retort we hear, is you can't do this. You can't ask me this because it's a HIPAA violation. I have HIPAA rights, and this is something that you can't as an employer ask. The good news for you is HIPAA doesn't apply to employers. HIPAA applies to healthcare providers and related entities that protects the confidentiality of patient information. For those of you who are on here who are a healthcare facility who treat your employees, obviously then HIPAA would apply. But 99% of you who are on here, that does not apply. So if an employee comes to you and says, I have HIPAA rights, you can't ask me that, you can't ask about my vaccination status, the answer to that is yes, I can. HIPAA doesn't apply. So, and as a side note, vaccination status isn't a protected class unless you have a disability that prevents you from getting the vaccine. So that's an easy one. The next one, the FDA hadn't approved, or there's still a few that are under emergency use authorization, so you can't make me take the vaccine. Well, emergency use authorization is approval, period. So yes, it can be mandated. Secondly, Pfizer is under full approval, and we are expecting others to follow. So there is a fully approved vaccine. And so this argument that it's not fully approved has now gone out the window. Again, you might likely to be here, it's rushed. We've already talked about that. We are not going to use this narrative, or we're not going to allow this narrative to be used to push forward a personal agenda. Because if you recall, we are an at-will state. Unless you've got a contract, unless you've got a religious accommodation or a medical accommodation that I think Jason's going to talk about later, you are free as an employee to work anywhere else. This is a requirement of working here, whether it's because of the government or your own personal policy. And if you have a personal objection to this, you are free to find another place of employment. No hard feelings. That is the beauty of the at-will state. So remember, this is something that we have to discuss in a diplomatic way, because there are elevated feelings, there are elevated emotions, but these are the facts. They are free to work someplace else. Now, I think Jason's going to discuss later in the hour what's going to happen when boosters are going to be recommended, if that's going to fit into your mandatory policy, what you should do with that. And, that is going to be another topic for us to discuss, I'm sure. All right, so let's talk about the ADA and GINA. So just as a reminder, GINA is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that prohibits employers from having or using genetic information in the course of employment. So the way that comes into play is if you know that I have a family history of heart disease, I'm up for a promotion that is a high stress job, and you say, oh, Dad died of a heart attack, maybe she's genetically predisposed to that. I don't know if she can handle that stress. That would be the use of genetic information to discriminate against me. So GINA is something that is not commonly used, but it is something that's gaining attraction through the EEOC. So it's important to know what it is and to know where it can be implicated. Obviously, the ADA allows for medical accommodations from a mandatory vaccine policy. And again, Jason's going to talk about that. But here we have a couple of points. Again, facts, not fiction. Vaccination does not qualify as a medical exam. So we don't have to worry about the ADA in terms of what you need to prove or establish before requiring a vaccine. There's no job related and consistent with the business necessity as it would be if you were requiring a medical exam. Now, pre-vaccination screening questions, if you are going to ask those, then you might have to worry about the ADA. But we're not going to, generally speaking, as an employer, ask pre-screening questions unless you're doing an on-site clinic. And if that's the case, we've got a whole other seminar we can talk to you about. You can request, as we all know at this point, documentation of vaccination status. And again, that must be kept confidential. Vaccination status, while not a protected class, it is confidential information. So I recommend that if you work in a company that needs to disclose vaccination status, for example, you have a customer or client that won't allow individuals on site unless they're vaccinated, you get a written consent from your employees that it's going to be disclosed in this limited scenario. You also have to be prepared to answer questions about the inference of my vaccination status being disclosed. If, for example, you have a policy in your workplace that only unvaccinated individuals must wear masks or must take a COVID test, it's going to disclose their vaccination status. And some employees might take offense to that. And because it's confidential information, we're going to have to figure out how we deal with that. And the best way to deal with that is to get assigned consent. And we can also talk about other ways as well. But that is the inference of, oh, if I'm wearing a mask, people assume I'm unvaccinated because that's our policy. And that's disclosing my vaccination status. Again, you're free to work someplace else. And I say it very bluntly, obviously in the workplace, we're going to be more diplomatic than I am today. But between us in this, I think you can, you can appreciate it more if we just state it bluntly that they can work someplace else. So. All right, finally, we've got two more. There is a myth that vaccine policies won't allow for religious or medical accommodations. There's been some buzz about that, oh, I heard that no healthcare facility is going to accept a religious accommodation. That's not true. It may be that at the end of the interactive process, which is always required for accommodation requests, It may be that none of the religious accommodations are approved, and that's because of an undue hardship standard and the other reasons that Jason will talk about. But you as a company will still have to go through the interactive process, and you can't have a blanket denial for all accommodations. And finally, I sort of jumped the gun on this a little bit, but you'll have this myth that vaccine mandates are a new thing. As we've discussed, they've been around in healthcare in our public school system for all of my life and all of yours. And by and large, this myth is perpetuated by rumor, conjecture, lack of information, and a personal agenda. It is not new. Workplaces, for example, in healthcare have required vaccines for routinely. And they have also dealt with, by the way, the religious and medical accommodations. You're going to hear people say, you're taking away my rights. As a private employer, you don't give rights. And so there is no taking away of rights. And let's just, again, let's think about common sense. And I know you guys have seen this, social media and elsewhere. You've seen these examples of where people claim their rights were being taken away. And the biggest one I've got is when, in my lifetime, just a decade or so ago, when Kentucky banned smoking in all bars and restaurants. There was a big uproar. Oh, it's going to decline revenue. People aren't going to go. You can't take away my right to smoke in a bar or restaurant. And by God, when I go to a state that doesn't ban that, it is absolutely noticeable. It has not affected anything. And guess what? We can impose these rules for public health reasons. So with that basis of some common sense, with some facts and some myth busting, I'm going to turn it over to Claire to talk about testing policies and vaccine incentives.
Hey, y'all. Just so we don't get inundated by comments, I do not have COVID. I have really, really bad allergies. So please forgive me for coughing. But Cindy is perfectly safe, I promise you. Okay, so I have been asked to talk about testing policies and vaccination incentives. And so we're going to jump to that. Now, you may, as an employer, have a number of reasons why you don't want to mandate a vaccine. And if you're not caught up in the executive order, Biden's executive order, you can make that choice not to mandate vaccines. Maybe you have a number of hesitant employees who are either irreplaceable based on their skill level or what they bring to your company, or that can't easily be replaced. I know a lot of employers are desperate to get new workers in and are having a really hard time pulling in new employees who are qualified. I mean, that's a real issue. You may worry about the vaccination mandate impacting diversity efforts. Prior to COVID, I can barely remember it all, but we were talking a lot about diversity and how it affected our workplace. And a lot of companies were trying to enhance diversity because we realized it makes us more productive and it makes us more efficient and it makes us better companies. So you might worry about that issue, or the public relations repercussions. Depending on where you live, your community might have some severe emotional reaction to a vaccination mandate that you want to sidestep. Or you yourself might have those reactions and you don't want to implement a mandate for your employees, knowing that you have objections personally. So there's a lot of reasons why you may not want to implement a mandatory vaccine if you're not legally obligated to. And you still have some options to help protect your employees and help protect your clients and customers. Some of those are vaccination incentives. So if you want to encourage your employees to get vaccinated, but you don't want to take that last step of mandating it, you can implement some vaccination incentives. Or you can implement some testing requirements. President Biden has implemented, for those who have accommodations, either religious or disability related, they would be obligated to get weekly tests. As an employer, if you have folks who object to a vaccination, that might be something that you would implement as well. Okay, so let's talk about some there are so many different incentives you can offer. I will say, employees are permitted to offer pretty much anything they want to offer as long as they're not administering the shot. And I find, and I've, in this whole COVID situation, there are some healthcare employers who want to administer the shot. Either they have access to the vaccination, or, there's other incentives for them to do so. I find this is a bigger headache than it's worth. So I generally counsel my clients, unless you have a real strong financial reason to administer the shot yourself, to have another pharmacy or another entity administer the shot. So we're going to talk as if you don't administer the shot. And in those cases, there are so many incentives you can offer to incentivize your employees to make the choice to get the vaccine. You can give food, the most popular food, cash, experiences. You can have a raffle that mixes some of those. So for big ticket items, you can raffle a car, you can raffle a trip, you can really get creative with what your employees need. I know a business who was feeling really empathetic to the hard work their employees were putting in. So made a raffle or gave an incentive of a housekeeping, a week of housekeeping, or free delivery of groceries or free groceries, just to help those folks out, and then also incentivize vaccination. So those also work. Washington State, fun fact, has an incentive, joints for jabs. So when I say you can get creative, you can get creative. Now, we can't do that in Kentucky, none of that for Kentucky, but you can really think outside the box and try to figure out what your employees need and want. In terms of testing requirements, some employers have introduced a policy which requires their employees to choose one of two options: either get vaccinated or be regularly tested. As we saw in Biden's executive order, this has kind of picked up some steam. So this has a dual benefit. One, it makes it inconvenient to not get vaccinated. So if somebody doesn't have, incredibly strong feelings and it's more about inconvenience, this puts this kind of balances the inconvenience. So they will probably likely get, vaccinated rather than have to go through the process of getting tested every week and returning that test and, certifying that test. Here's the problem with this one, though. There's still a question of who pays. And I have a poor intern looking into this issue right now, because insurance companies will only pay for these tests if they're medically necessary generally. And then there's all these rules about what the employer has to pay for. So if the employer mandates this for their own personal safety or their own desire, the question is, the employer will most likely have to pay for these tests to be given on a weekly basis, which could get quite expensive. Now, again, Biden has said that he is going to attempt to make these at-home kits readily available, which I think would eliminate some of this heartburn. And if it is an executive order that somebody has to comply with, so if you're an employer with over 100 employees and or you're a healthcare facility, most likely the fact that there's an executive order out there would put the burden on the employee versus you. But that's an issue that's outstanding, and I want everybody to be aware of. Excuse me. So the next thing we're going to talk about is booster shots. It's me, not Jason. Sorry, Jason.
Oops. And just so everybody knows, we do have a bunch of questions. So before we switch to you, Jason, we're going to take a few questions just to break this up a little bit.
That did not. That's okay. Okay. So for booster shots, we have some questions that are looking forward. It's likely that some, if not all, individuals will be recommended to receive booster shots. Right now, I think they're saying 8 months. Some other people say 6 months to make sure that you're healthy over time. But here are some questions to look forward to. Will vaccinated employees maintain their vaccination status after 6 months, 8 months, 10 months? Like when, as employers, will we cut it off? Now, some of that has to do with availability, right? We don't have booster shots readily available. I think September is the launch. And, we're going to all stand in line like we did the first time. But as employers, we have to figure out in terms of our policy, how long will we let it go? And so although I have been advising folks to put booster shots, the idea of a booster shot in a policy, I don't think that we can mandate at this point the how long employees can get to where they get a booster shot. We can't say you have your booster shot at 8 months, because it's very likely, like for me, it won't be available 8 months after I got my first shot. I won't be in line yet. So I think that we have to think about those issues. And then let's say we pass that 8 months. What are the rules with those employees? Do they have to mask if we didn't have a mask policy for everybody? Do they have to socially distance? Do we have to install those policies? How is OSHA going to deal with it? And so I think a lot of things related to booster shots are yet to be developed. But again, as Cindy said, we want to put that idea in folks' minds. If you have a mandated vaccination policy, or even if you're trying to incentivize vaccinations, I would mention and start that conversation with boosters now. And then the last question, which I think is going to be really fascinating for us as attorneys, but give you guys quite a lot of heartburn, is will employees who receive the first shot be able to claim exemptions from the booster, either religious accommodations or disability? And what will that look like? What will that process look like? And so there's a lot of questions to be discussed and to be thought about with booster shots. But right now, let's just put the issue in folks' minds that if you are promoting a vaccination policy, that a booster shot policy is coming right down the pike.
We have a bunch of good questions. We'll take just a couple right now, and then we'll move on to keeping COVID out of your workplace and the reasonable accommodations that Jason will discuss. Keep the questions coming, and we'll answer all of them at the end, but take a couple of them right now since they relate to these topics, since we're changing topics a little bit.
Oh, I had to put on my glasses to be able to see that, y'all.
Let me see.
How do we address the lack of test availability? The mandate requires weekly testing for unvaccinated staff, but there are no tests to be found for us to do this testing. That is certainly a problem. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that, I don't know what the unavailability of testing is. From my understanding, we do have, I'm in Jefferson County. From my understanding, we do have availability here in Jefferson County. You might be in an area where there isn't, where employees are going to have to drive maybe 30, 40, maybe even an hour. Yeah.
Well, and I would say the executive order specifies that President Biden is going to make efforts to make it more readily available, and that they're going to push these home tests be available in all pharmacies. So I think, the mandate hasn't really been enacted until it gets codified in the CMS and until OSHA picks it up.
But if you as an employer institute that, the issue might be that you're going to have to pay the employee to drive to go get that test.
Yeah.
Because that will be compensable time more than likely.
Well, or another option is, if you feel comfortable, I think it depends on whether or not you feel comfortable. But if you're, if they have it at a pharmacy, if there are tests available, you can make those available to your employees, depending on how much it costs. You will most likely bear the cost unless you're under some kind of executive order. So, grab a whole bunch of them and hand them out.
So another good question, I've actually received this from several clients, that customers are asking about vaccine status of employees. And if HIPAA doesn't apply, can we share this information? And then I do believe that you can't share it without the written consent of your employee. But that also means a discussion with the employee that you can't go work for this customer unless I disclose it. And obviously you have to be vaccinated. And therefore, if you're not going to give me the consent, I don't have work for you to do.
Yeah.
And it's a tough conversation, but if it's required by your customers, your vendors, your clients, you're going to have to get that written consent.
And one of the things that I've been doing is, I think that you can say 50% of our workforce is currently vaccinated. You're not identifying, of course, unless there's, two people, you're not identifying who is and who isn't. You're just letting them know that you're not at 100% yet. But, you can say, if you have a preference and you do not want to be served by a unvaccinated employee, you can let me know. And then we'll have to make those decisions internally.
So let's take one more before we turn it over to Jason and Claire. I think this one, it goes right to one of your topics about you have employees that already got the vaccine, but now the employer is offering an incentive program. So do the employees that got the vaccine before the incentive program, do they get the incentive?
So this is just a question of fairness, general fairness. I think it's up to you. I think in terms of goodwill, especially considering the booster is coming down the pike, you have two options. You could say, yes, I'm going to give it to everybody because I want to incentivize vaccinations. And I know when the booster comes down the pike that I want everybody to be vaccinated and I want them to feel like they're going to get that incentive. Or you could say, everybody who has already gotten it gets the booster, but you have to gets the incentive, but you have to do it by X time, and anybody after doesn't. And that way you incentivize folks to jump on the bandwagon quickly and fast, at the very beginning.
Recap.
Okay. So takeaway, sorry, they switched my screen. Okay. So now takeaway for employers about our section. You want to determine if you're required to implement a mandate. So we're talking healthcare, we're talking folks who have over 100 employees. If you're not, think about whether or not you want to implement this policy. I think right now is a great time if you've been considering it because you have coverage. You do want to store your vaccination records as confidential health information pursuant to ADA. So you just want to make sure it's in a secure file. Most folks know how to handle that. If you don't, feel free to give us a call and we'll help you out. And you do have to give reasonable accommodations pursuant to the ADA and Title VII. And so you want to be prepared for that. You want to think about that eventuality. And then factor the possibility of booster shots into the vaccination policies now, start those discussions now. So it's not quite surprising. As Cindy said, we have, as humans, have an amazing ability to get used to the situation. And so I think if we are given enough time, we'll get used to this new reality.
All right, that's done. So.
Yep. Hello, everybody. I've been referenced in Cindy and Claire's presentation, but my name is Jason Holland. I'm an attorney in the Lexington office of McBrayer. Cindy and Claire are in the Louisville office. That's the reason that we had some screen schematics there to jump around. But Cindy and Claire have been discussing with you all vaccines, and vaccines are kind of the way to keep COVID-19, or one of the ways, the best way probably, to keep COVID-19 out of your workplace. The slides that I'll be covering, which is the remainder of the seminar, will do two things. They'll focus on what to do when COVID does strike the workplace. And then I'll be discussing just kind of the general impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic as a whole has had on the employment law landscape. And so with respect to when COVID gets into the workplace, or when COVID strikes, as the slide says, there are four main responses that employers should consider and take into account. And none of them are new for anybody that's been around for the last year and a half. But the first one is talking about masking. If I can figure out how to change the slide here. All right, now we've got it. I apologize for that. But kind of the overall theme both with what Cindy and Claire were talking about and what I'll be talking about, is that COVID-19 has put everyone in a position and in an environment that is ever changing. It is difficult to keep up with what the guidance is from the CDC. There's no shortage of information, both some of it untrue and some of it true, as Cindy discussed. And even as attorneys, we do have our job is to help you all, employers and individuals, keep up with the newest recommendations. And masking is one of those that has changed pretty significantly over the last few months. I think that everyone remembers that as the vaccine started to become more widespread in its use, the CDC changed its guidance in May that allowed vaccinated individuals to not have to wear their mask indoors or outdoors or anywhere. And what that resulted in was the relaxation of policies, mask policies from both employers and then, places of public accommodation. Unfortunately, as the Delta variant began to surge, the CDC changed the recommendation and now recommend that all individuals, whether or not they're vaccinated or unvaccinated, wear a mask indoors, provided that they're in one of the high transmission counties. Unfortunately, I think everyone here knows that I believe all those counties in Kentucky are what's deemed a high transmission county. So this guidance touches every county in Kentucky, and I believe in, unfortunately, most counties in the United States right now. And so in light of this changing guidance, employers should consider, if they've not already done so, reinstating their masking policy for employees indoors. And if they didn't have a masking policy in place before, should consider implementing one. It's important to remember and to take into account, as with anything in employment law, to take into account the circumstances of your office. Certainly, if the vast majority of your employees are in closed-in offices where they're by themselves, masks might only be required in the public area. But while vaccination is certainly an effective, if not the most effective way to stop the spread of COVID, masking is something that the CDC has told us is very effective as well, and can help to prevent these outbreaks in the workplace that we all know are very detrimental to any employer's efficiency. Another way that can help to limit these outbreaks is social distancing. I know that prior to March of 2021 or April of 2020, I did not know or had not really heard the word social distancing, but I think we're all well familiar of it now. And some of it doesn't even require a policy. A lot of times I find myself just distancing just out of habit now from the last year and a half. But this is one area that the guidance from the CDC, OSHA, and other entities really hasn't changed. That guidance still is that policies and measures need to be in effect to keep employees not just 6 foot away from each other, but also the employee away from the public. I know that's difficult depending on what kind of business you may have, but that is something to keep in mind as well. It's not just employees, but it's also the interactions that the employees have with members of the public. So with social distancing and masking combined, and then of course the vaccinations, we hope that the incidence of COVID-19 would be limited in your office, but in the event that it's not, the next consideration and tool that you have is quarantining. And quarantining, like masking, has been an ever-changing rules. The CDC has now delineated between vaccinated individuals and unvaccinated individuals. And it is our experience, both in the employment law context, but also as employers, at our firm, that it's a good idea to have a specific policy in place for quarantine and to apply it across the board, depending on the situation. And so while the CDC guidance is one thing, and I'm going to talk about specifics of what the CDC guidelines are, it's important to remember that it's guidance, and you are free as employers to do more than what the CDC recommends if you believe that it's necessary to help protect your workers and to keep your business open. And one other thing to remember about the CDC guidance is that in some cases, whenever you have exposures, you will have the involvement of the local health departments or medical providers themselves that recommend specific periods of quarantine. And certainly we recommend following whatever the government health departments and or the medical providers say, in addition to whatever policy that you have in place. But right now, the current guidance from the CDC is that if you have what's called a close contact, which I think most of us are familiar with now, means that you were within 6 feet or less of an individual for 15 minutes or more combined over a 24-hour period, that individual was positive for COVID, or within 2 days of them developing symptoms of COVID. If you're a fully vaccinated individual, the CDC does not require that you quarantine unless you have symptoms. However, they do recommend that you get tested 3 to 5 days after your close contact, and that you wear a mask indoors for 14 days. And again, that's a baseline. Employers are free to require their employees to quarantine for those 3 to 5 days until they get that negative test. And then one thing that's not really changed since the beginning of contact tracing and quarantining from the CDC is its guidelines for those that are not fully vaccinated. And that is a 14-day quarantine, although employers do have the ability to shorten if they believe that's appropriate for their workplace. And you can have the employee come back after day 7 if they were negative after a test that was administered on day 5. And one thing that I would point out here is that these guidelines are based on being fully vaccinated. And what fully vaccinated means is if you took one of the shots that require the 2 doses, which I believe that's the Pfizer, and that's the one I know that's 2 doses. There may be another one, but then it's that it is within 2 weeks after that second dose. If you took one that is a 1 dose shot, then it's 2 weeks after that single dose. And I believe that one's the Johnson & Johnson. And I'm not sure on the Moderna, and I'm sure there's people on the call that do know. I'm being told it's 2. So it would be 2 weeks after that one as well. And then if you do have someone who is positive in the office that you need to quarantine, then you get into and should continue to do the contact tracing. Contact tracing allows you to identify anybody in your office that would have had a close contact and can help limit these severe outbreaks. And I skipped over, but that was just our preview slide kind of. If you have a severe outbreak, we hope that with the vaccinations, with the masking, and with the social distancing, and then ultimately the quarantining, you should not have a severe outbreak. But in the event of a severe outbreak, you certainly should consider, hopefully this doesn't happen again, but allowing all of your workers to telework. And then our advice would be to remember any lessons that you learned during the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of you had workers working from home, and to use those lessons to maximize the benefits of telework and having your workers at home. However, like I said, following this other guidance that we've talked about today will hopefully avoid the need to put your office in a severe lockdown or working from home. And so those are kind of the things that you think of whenever you have COVID in the office. But my last section that I'll be talking about here is the effect that COVID and the pandemic as a whole has had on the workplace moving forward. And one of the more quickly evolving areas of the law is how COVID is being treated with respect to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And recently, one of the issues that has come up and is receiving significant attention from multiple governmental agencies is this idea of what's called long COVID. And I think many of you probably heard some of these people as being identified as long haulers. And what this is, it's an unfortunate issue that has impacted some of those who suffered from COVID-19. And they have these symptoms long after after they're negative and after the virus has, presumably or has moved on from them. And some of these symptoms include shortness of breath, muscle pain, heart palpitations, extreme fatigue, headaches, brain fog is a significant issue. And these individuals also have issues with some of their vital organs like their heart, lungs, kidneys. Importantly, at the outset of the pandemic, the EEOC did say that COVID-19 itself, the infection, is not a disability, and a lot of that stems from the direct threat that it poses to the workplace. However, it's important to distinguish between COVID-19 and those that are experiencing this long COVID and these symptoms. And what the DOJ and HHS, as the slide says, and actually just last week, the EEOC has now said, is that if these symptoms of long COVID, like similar to the ones listed here, limit a major life function, that could be considered a disability under the ADA, which that's just consistent with the definition of a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the question is whether or not the symptoms that employee is experiencing, whether those actually limit a major life function. And if you have an employee who is facing some of these unfortunate symptoms, you should treat them as you treat any other reasonable accommodation request. And so it should be assessed on an individual basis, and the employer should work through the typical accommodation interactive process. And the question here that we should focus on is how that condition impacts the ability of the employee to perform the essential functions of his or her position, and what kind of accommodations might allow them to perform those jobs. And some of the accommodations that are listed there on the slide, you can read them for yourself, but those are just some recommendations. And again, that's all going to be based upon what is specific for each individualized scenario and what each employee is actually dealing with. So outside of the COVID specific context, COVID and then the long haul systems or symptoms, COVID and the pandemic as a whole has had an effect on reasonable accommodations generally. And one of those ways is the availability of certain reasonable accommodations and what is reasonable actually. And after the pandemic, as we return to the office, employers will, just like before the pandemic and during, will receive accommodation requests. And in that interactive process, as you're working with the employee, before you deny their proposed accommodation, one thing you have to consider strongly is whether or not that proposed accommodation poses an undue hardship. And one of the most common accommodations that employees request is to work from home to help with their disability. And before the pandemic, remote work seemed a lot less feasible than it does after the pandemic, as many employers had their employees work from home for a number of months. And so whenever you're engaged in this interactive process, there's no question that how the remote work went during the pandemic can have an effect on what is reasonable in the context of accommodations. That said, employers they never have to, or they're never required to alter the essential functions of a position. And in-person attendance is an essential function in some cases. There's no question. And depending on the circumstances, again, it's an individual analysis for each employee. An employer may simply have just waived that essential job function as a result of the pandemic, but that does not mean that they've permanently altered the requirement that this employee be in person at the workplace. And so it's just something to keep in mind as you go through this common reasonable accommodation process, and to keep in mind the various efforts that you've implemented during the pandemic and how those might affect the reasonableness of a proposed accommodation. And then finally, as I said, well, my slides are going fast. But as I said at the beginning, one thing that we've learned over the last year and a half is that this is a very ever-changing environment. And we recommend that employers keep up with the guidance from the CDC, from OSHA, and from other governmental entities. And HR, you all are well aware of the resources that are out there to help you with that. And we recommend as strongly as we can that you take as many efforts as you can to stay up to date on the most recent guidance. And we obviously are here for you and can answer any questions that you may have individually, or we have a very updated McBrayer employment blog, and would recommend that you check that out for our most recent posts. And then there's our specific contact information. And so with that, I will open it up for any questions. But if there are none, we thank you for coming and participating in the webinar today. And we're always here to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. We do have a lot of really good questions, and the three of us will do our best to get to all of them. The first one I just want to address quickly about religious accommodations. Jason touched on the ADA accommodations. So the religious accommodation comes into play when someone articulates a sincerely held religious belief. Religion is defined very broadly, that include moral and ethical objections as well. You have to assume from the start that the objection is sincere, unless you have objective evidence that the religious, and again, religious being broad, objection is not sincere. So for example, if I say I'm a vegan, this is a animal-based product, I don't want to take the vaccine, but you see me eating a cheeseburger every Friday, doesn't appear to be sincere. If someone brings forth a religious belief that is not founded in, or that is completely contrary to facts, then it could be viewed as not sincere. If you have someone say, I don't take any vaccine, but they took the flu vaccine yet last year, again, that's objective evidence that it is not sincere. It's going to be a very difficult conversation and going to be a more difficult way to deny the accommodation on that sincerely held belief. You as an employer can deny an accommodation on religious basis if there's an undue hardship posed to the employer. The undue hardship standard for religious accommodations is a far lower bar than the disability related standard. And so you take into account your current vaccination status in the workplace, whether others will be unduly burdened because duties will shift, and mere inconvenience as opposed to a substantial cost. There are other factors as well, but those are generally the parameters that you'll look at. You can deny on undue hardship in that respect, also if it poses too much of a significant risk to employees, patients, vendors, clients, et cetera. And so there is a process, there is an interactive process that you would go through on the sincerely held side, and then whether the accommodation would pose an undue hardship. And then Jason, there's a really good question here about sick leave. Can you refuse sick leave for employees who refuse to get a COVID vaccine? What are your thoughts on that?
I guess it would depend on whether, if you have a policy, I assume the question is presuming that they are sick with COVID.
Yes.
It would be my thought that you would need to comply with whatever your sick leave policy is. But if you have a vaccine policy in place that requires them to get a vaccine, then at that point, then they're in violation of that policy, and you would be free to take whatever disciplinary action that you need to, that you believe necessary. But go ahead.
I would add that you want to make sure that you don't take discriminatory action against anybody who didn't get a vaccine because of a disability or didn't get a vaccine because of a religious accommodation, and make sure you alter your policy in advance. So I wouldn't suggest, as Jason said, I wouldn't change it after the fact. You have a policy that's been in place for forever. It's never been edited. It doesn't relate in any way to COVID or your mandate, then probably not. Then you don't want to take that action. But if you announce this policy, everybody's aware of this policy, and it excludes the folks who had accommodation, then I think it's fair game. Again, as Cindy said, your vaccination status is not a protected status under the law. So unless
and I have helped clients write policies that say, if you get sick with COVID and you're not vaccinated, it's unpaid time off. If you get sick with COVID and you're vaccinated, you can have paid time off.
And that can be another incentive that you offer in order to, encourage folks who may be on the fence for, reasons not relating to religious accommodation or disability to kind of jump into the deep water.
All right, Claire, you talked a little bit about health insurance. We've got a question about, can health insurance rates be adjusted depending upon vaccination status?
So, you know what? I have seen people do this. I probably am I'm not the right person. I would say a benefits person would be somebody to ask about that one.
Delta Airlines did it.
Yeah. Companies have done it, and I know that it's possible. I just wouldn't feel comfortable advising one of my clients about it. I would pull in Alan Paul, who is our benefits guy, and I would get him to make sure that is taken care of appropriately.
In the chat, we have a question about part-time hourly employees who are quarantined. Are they entitled to hourly pay for the quarantine period? So under the Families First for Coronavirus Response Act, at the beginning of the year or beginning of the pandemic, we had that emergency paid sick leave. That expired December 31st, 2020, but employers were allowed to voluntarily extend it through March 31st and now through September 30th. So if and only if you have voluntarily extended that emergency paid sick leave, then if you had a part-time employee who was quarantined and qualified for the leave, then you would take the average weekly hours, which you would go into the regulations. We can help you calculate if it's not a standard 20 hours a week, then they would get paid pursuant to the law what their hourly rate was, depending on the reasons why they're quarantined, whether for themselves or for a family member. If you haven't extended that emergency paid sick leave, then your paid leave policies would be the only thing that you would have to follow.
We have an interesting question. Are private companies being asked or required to offer incentives? Private companies are not being required to offer incentives. I think, it's just another tool in the toolbox. I think that there are some politicians who are, hoping that private businesses will kind of take up this fight and really serve as a means to get vaccination rates in the United States up. So, maybe they're being asked, but it's certainly not required.
And there's a question about whether this presentation changes for state government employers versus private companies. And so to the extent that there are due process rights or constitutional rights or freedom of speech issues, that would be related to you as a public or state employer. But those issues obviously do not apply to private employers.
I will say, as the labor dog in the group, that if you have a contract, if you have a labor agreement, a collective bargaining agreement, a lot of what we have said will alter based on that CBA. So whether or not your employer can institute a mandatory policy or, give you incentives, all of those things are often guided by the CBA and the management rights clause. So take that with a grain of salt as well. And if you have a contract, you're going to want to talk to a labor lawyer. Feel free to give me a call.
So there's a comment, the incentives that you're talking about, writing into policy sounds like coercion and blackmail to me. And so the thing is that we incentivize employees in a lot of different ways. We have wellness programs that we incentivize people through wellness programs to have a certain number of steps a day to join the YMCA. And we give incentives here, the firm will pay or the company will pay
To stop smoking.
Stop smoking programs. So we incentivize employees for health reasons in many different areas. We incentivize employees for sales and add bonuses. And so, it is a method and means to assist in your choice or mandate to have a vaccination policy. And again, you're free to offer them. Employees are free to find other places to work if they do not want to be subject to a mandatory policy.
Okay, I'm looking for any new ones.
I think that's, did you get this one right here?
Let's see. Yeah, we did that one.
And you got this one?
We're under the executive order, but my understanding, we still have a choice about mandating vaccine as a regular, go ahead, Claire, as regular testing as an option.
So, and I think we'll know more once the executive order is put into practice. So all of these governmental agencies have to flesh it out. I mean, it's kind of the same as with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It was kind of this, vomit on the page of what everybody said they want to happen. And then, the EEOC worked it through, everybody kind of talked about it, and we figured out what the rules were. And I think it's going to be like that. The way I read it currently is that the testing is primarily for folks who ask for an accommodation. So you're mandated to implement the vaccine policy, and that for people who cannot get vaccinated, such as religious, which would beg the question, well, who can't get vaccinated? Maybe pregnant people can't, maybe folks with religious accommodation, medical issues, because they might make exceptions that we don't, in addition to what we normally think of. Whoever those are, they can have, their option is testing. But I don't think that the employer gets that choice. I think that they're going to make that choice for us.
Yes to this.
All right, well, the webinar will be available to share.
Oh.
And then have we received clarification if the mandate is 100 employees for the whole company or per location like the FMLA? We don't know yet.
Yeah.
We're trying, eventually it'll be put in writing. It was an announcement that has not been put in writing and sent out to all of us. And I do believe that that's coming in the next few weeks. And like Jason said, whether it's our blog or someone else's blog, stay on top of it and stay on the news alerts. And to the extent that any of this changes between now and our next webinar, we will be updating it. We will not be going back into all of this in detail, but we will provide updates for any changes. And the one thing we've learned over the past 18 months is things change daily. So there will be that touched upon. We really appreciate your time and attention in joining us. And if you have any questions, you've got our contact information, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Also, real quickly, anybody who's curious about seeing this again or getting a copy of the slides, we are going to send out both the link to the video and the slides themselves in an email to all of the registrants. We're looking to do that by the end of this week. Please feel free to pass that on, share it with whomever you think needs to see it. And we look forward to your questions and comments. And please, again, consider our next two webinars. The next one's going to be on the changes happening at the National Labor Relations Board on October 12th. And then we've also got our annual scary stories from the HR department, which will cover a potpourri of employment law issues happening on October 27th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.